Think medieval justice was about fair trials and reasonable punishments? Think again. You're about to discover that medieval courts didn't just allow torture, they required it. We're talking about a legal system so twisted, so absolutely deranged, that it makes modern horror movies look like Disney cartoons. These weren't underground dungeons run by sadistic psychopaths. These were official court procedures, sanctioned by law, supervised by judges and cheered on by crowds of spectators who brought their children to watch. Buckle up, because you're about to dive into the most legally sanctioned brutality in human history. From machines designed to slowly stretch human bodies until they snapped, to trials where surviving meant you were guilty and dying meant you were innocent, these are the medieval torture methods that were not only completely legal, they were considered the height of civilized justice. Spoiler alert, everything you thought you knew about medieval law and order is about to be completely destroyed. The rack wasn't just the most famous torture device in medieval history, it was the gold standard of legal interrogation. Picture this. You're accused of a crime, dragged into a courtroom, and the judge doesn't ask for evidence or witnesses. Instead, he orders you to be strapped to a wooden frame and slowly stretched until your joints pop out of their sockets. And this wasn't some rogue operation, this was standard legal procedure in medieval courts across Europe. The rack was essentially a wooden bed frame with rollers at each end. The victim would be tied at the wrists and ankles, and then the rollers would be turned slowly, stretching the body until the joints began to separate. The beauty of the rack, according to medieval legal scholars, was its precision. Trained operators could control exactly how much pressure to apply, making it possible to cause excruciating pain without immediate death. But here's where it gets truly insane. The rack was considered a merciful form of torture. Medieval legal texts actually praised it as a humane method because it didn't involve fire, sharp instruments, or immediate mutilation. The fact that it could permanently cripple a person was seen as a minor side effect compared to other available options. It's like medieval judges looked at a machine designed to slowly tear human bodies apart and said, you know what? This is the compassionate choice. The psychological torture was just as devastating as the physical. Victims would be brought into the torture chamber and shown the rack before the questioning even began. The mere sight of the device was often enough to extract confessions. Court records show that many people confessed to crimes they didn't commit rather than face the rack, which was exactly the point. The legal system wasn't interested in finding the truth, it was interested in getting confessions. The rack was so effective and so widely accepted that it remained a standard legal procedure for over 400 years. The Tower of London kept multiple racks in constant use, and court records show that they were operated by skilled technicians who were paid regular salaries by the Crown. We're talking about professional torturers who went to work every day, clocked in, and spent their time legally dismembering people for the government. But the rack was just the beginning of medieval Europe's love affair with legalized brutality. Wait until you hear about the time when medieval courts decided that God himself should determine guilt or innocence through methods that would make modern prosecutors weep. Medieval judges had a brilliant solution to the problem of determining guilt or innocence. Why bother with evidence when you can just let God decide? Welcome to Trial by Ordeal, where the legal system literally outsourced justice to divine intervention, creating the most insane court procedures in human history. The logic was actually quite simple in a completely deranged medieval way. If someone was innocent, God would protect them from harm during the ordeal. If they were guilty, God would allow them to suffer. It was foolproof theology with one tiny flaw. The ordeals were designed to be impossible to survive, meaning that God apparently wanted everyone to be found guilty. Trial by fire was exactly what it sounds like. The accused would be forced to walk barefoot over red-hot coals or carry a piece of burning iron for a specific distance. Their hands and feet would then be bandaged and examined after 3 days. If the wounds were healing cleanly, they were innocent. If the wounds were infected or festering, they were guilty, because apparently medieval people believed that innocent people had superhuman healing abilities. The trial by hot water was even more brutal. A stone or piece of metal would be placed in a cauldron of boiling water, and the accused would have to retrieve it with their bare hands. The depth of the water determined the severity of the crime, wrist deep for minor offences, elbow deep for serious crimes. After fishing around in boiling water for a metal object, the accused would have their hands bandaged and examined later for signs of divine healing. But the most insane ordeal was trial by cold water, which operated on completely backwards logic. The accused would be bound and thrown into a body of water. If they sank, they were innocent, and if they floated, they were guilty. The reasoning was that pure water would reject evil, causing guilty people to float, while innocent people would be accepted by the water and sink. Of course, innocent people who sank often drowned, but that was considered the acceptable casualty of divine justice. The trial by consecrated bread was reserved for clergy members accused of crimes. The accused priest would attempt to swallow a piece of blessed bread while saying a prayer. If he choked or had difficulty swallowing, he was guilty. If he swallowed easily, he was innocent. Medieval people turned eating into a lie detector test and somehow convinced themselves this was a reliable method of determining guilt. The most terrifying aspect of trial by ordeal was its complete legal legitimacy. These weren't desperate measures used in the absence of proper courts. They were the proper courts. Kings, nobles, and church officials all participated in and endorsed these procedures. Legal scholars wrote detailed treatises on proper ordeal techniques, and priests blessed the instruments and supervised the procedures. The system was so entrenched that it took centuries to eliminate. Even when more rational legal procedures were introduced, many people continued to request trial by ordeal because they believed it was the only way to truly prove their innocence. Medieval people had more faith in boiling water than in human judgment, which tells you everything you need to know about medieval confidence in their legal system. But if you think drowning innocent people and burning suspects with hot iron was extreme, wait until you discover the medieval execution method that turned human destruction into a public festival that lasted for days. The breaking wheel wasn't just an execution method, it was the medieval equivalent of the Super Bowl, complete with cheering crowds, food vendors, and families bringing their children for a day of educational entertainment. This wasn't a quick death in a dark dungeon. This was a carefully orchestrated public spectacle where the slow destruction of a human body became community bonding time. The wheel itself was a large wooden wheel, usually about 6 feet in diameter, mounted horizontally on a post. The condemned person would be tied to the wheel with their limbs stretched out along the spokes. Then came the main event. The executioner would use a heavy iron hammer to systematically break every bone in the victim's body, starting with the limbs and working toward the torso. But here's where medieval creativity really shined. The breaking wasn't random. There were specific techniques and sequences that professional executioners followed, almost like a choreographed dance of destruction. The arms and legs would be broken in multiple places, usually at the joints and along the major bones. The chest would be crushed to collapse the lungs. The process was designed to cause maximum pain while keeping the victim alive as long as possible. The crowd participation was absolutely insane. Spectators would cheer for particularly skillful breaks, jeer at the condemned person, and place bets on how long they would survive. Children would be lifted onto shoulders to get a better view, and families would pack lunches to enjoy during the proceedings. It was like medieval people turned human destruction into a tailgate party. The legal framework around breaking on the wheel was elaborate and specific. Different crimes carried different breaking patterns. Murderers might have their arms broken first, while thieves might start with their legs. The number of breaks was specified by the court, and executioners were required to follow the sentence exactly. We're talking about a legal system so detailed that it included specific instructions for how to slowly destroy human bodies. The wheel served multiple purposes in medieval justice. It was punishment, deterrent, and entertainment all rolled into one. The public nature of the execution was crucial. Everyone needed to see what happened to lawbreakers. The prolonged suffering was intentional. Quick deaths didn't send the right message. And the spectacle aspect was essential. If people weren't entertained, they might not show up for the next execution. Some condemned individuals would survive on the wheel for days, slowly dying from their injuries while crowds continued to gather and watch. Water would be given to prolong the suffering, and physicians would sometimes be called in to ensure the victim didn't die too quickly. Medieval people turned dying into a performance art that required professional consultation. The breaking wheel was so popular that specialized executioners traveled from city to city, offering their services like medieval performers. These weren't amateur sadists, they were skilled professionals who took pride in their work and were paid well for their expertise. Cities would compete to hire the best wheel executioners because apparently medieval people had quality standards for their legal torture. But if you think the breaking wheel was the pinnacle of medieval legal brutality, prepare yourself for a torture method so simple, so effective, and so widely used that it became the go-to technique for courts across Europe. The strappado was medieval torture's greatest success story, a technique so elegantly simple and devastatingly effective that it became the Swiss Army knife of legal interrogation. All you needed was a rope, a pulley, and a complete disregard for human anatomy. The results were guaranteed joint dislocation, permanent disability, and confessions that would make modern police interrogators weep with envy. The basic strappado technique was brutally straightforward. The victim's hands would be tied behind their back, and a rope would be attached to their wrists. The rope was then thrown over a pulley or beam, and the victim would be hoisted into the air, suspended by their arms with their full body weight, pulling their shoulders out of their sockets. The immediate agony was indescribable, but that was just the beginning. The genius of the strappado was in its variations. The standard version involved simply hanging the victim until their shoulders dislocated, which usually took just a few minutes. But creative torturers developed the strappado with weights, where heavy stones or metal objects would be tied to the victim's feet, increasing the pulling force and accelerating the joint destruction. Some victims would have their shoulders ripped completely out of their sockets within seconds. The drop strappado was the premium version of this torture. The victim would be hoisted high into the air, then suddenly dropped partway down before being jerked to a stop by the rope. The sudden impact would destroy not just the shoulders but often the wrists, elbows, and spine as well. It was like bungee jumping, except the goal was to cause maximum bodily damage rather than recreational thrills. What made the strappado particularly insane was its portability and efficiency. Unlike elaborate devices like the rack or breaking wheel, the strappado could be set up anywhere with basic materials. Traveling judges could administer torture in remote villages, military commanders could interrogate prisoners in the field, and local officials could extract confessions without expensive equipment. It was the fast food of medieval torture, quick, cheap, and available everywhere. The legal framework surrounding the strappado was surprisingly sophisticated. Different crimes warranted different hanging times, and court records show precise specifications for how long someone should be suspended. Minor crimes might involve just a few minutes of hanging, while serious offenses could require hours of suspension. Some courts would specify multiple sessions, with victims being lowered, given time to recover, and then hoisted up again. The medical knowledge surrounding the strappado was actually quite advanced for its time. Medieval torturers understood exactly how much weight the human shoulder could support, how long someone could be suspended before permanent damage occurred, and how to maximize pain while minimizing immediate death. They turned human anatomy into a science of suffering, with techniques passed down through generations of professional torturers. The psychological impact of the strappado was just as devastating as the physical damage. Victims would often confess before being hoisted, simply from seeing the rope and pulley system. The mere threat of shoulder dislocation was enough to extract information, making the strappado an incredibly efficient interrogation tool. Courts loved it because it was fast, cheap, and almost always successful. The international standardization of the strappado was remarkable. From England to Italy, from France to Germany, the technique was basically identical. Legal scholars would write detailed treatises on proper strappado procedures, and professional torturers would travel between countries sharing techniques and innovations. Medieval Europe created an international torture curriculum with the strappado as the core requirement. But while professional torturers were perfecting their craft in specialized chambers, medieval communities were developing their own forms of legal brutality that turned your neighbors into your worst nightmare. The pillory and stocks weren't just punishment, they were community-sanctioned torture sessions where your friends, neighbors, and family members could legally assault you for entertainment. These devices turned every town square into a gladiatorial arena where public humiliation evolved into mob violence, and the line between punishment and murder became a matter of crowd enthusiasm. The pillory was a wooden framework with holes for the head and hands, forcing the victim to stand in an awkward, vulnerable position. The stocks were similar, but designed for sitting, with holes for the feet and sometimes the hands. Both devices were placed in the most public areas possible: town squares, market areas, church courtyards, anywhere crowds naturally gathered. The goal wasn't just punishment, it was public spectacle. But here's where medieval community justice got absolutely insane. The crowds weren't just supposed to watch, they were expected to participate. Throwing rotten food, animal waste, stones, and dead animals at people in the pillory was not only legal, it was encouraged. Local authorities would sometimes provide ammunition, selling rotten vegetables and spoiled meat, specifically for pelting prisoners. Medieval people turned public punishment into a profitable concession business. The escalation of violence was predictable and terrifying. What started as throwing food would quickly progress to stones, then to sharp objects, then to outright assault. People in the pillory would be beaten, stabbed, burned with hot coals, and sexually assaulted by crowds who knew they faced no legal consequences. The devices that were supposed to provide mild punishment regularly became execution methods when crowds got carried away. The social dynamics were absolutely brutal. People you knew, your neighbors, your customers, your church congregation, would line up to assault you. Children would be encouraged to participate as a form of moral education. Families would bring picnic lunches and make a day of watching someone slowly die from crowd violence. Medieval people turned human suffering into a community-building exercise. The variety of projectiles was limited only by local imagination. Rotten eggs, spoiled meat, human waste, animal entrails, sharp stones, broken pottery, and burning materials were all fair game. Some communities would organize competitions to see who could inflict the most creative punishment. We have records of people being blinded, permanently disfigured, and killed by crowd violence that was completely legal and officially encouraged. The duration of punishment made everything worse. People could be sentenced to hours or even days in the pillory, meaning that crowds had plenty of time to escalate their violence. Night shifts would take over from day crowds, ensuring that the assault never stopped. Some victims would be kept in the pillory for a week, slowly dying from accumulated injuries, while new crowds gathered daily to continue the torture. The legal protection for participants was absolute. No one could be prosecuted for assaulting someone in the pillory, no matter how severe the injuries. This created a legal free-fire zone where people could indulge their most violent impulses without consequence. Some individuals would travel from neighboring towns just to participate in particularly notorious pillory sessions. The psychological damage was often worse than the physical injuries. Victims who survived would be permanently ostracized from their communities, unable to look at neighbors without remembering their participation in the violence. The pillory didn't just punish crimes, it destroyed social bonds and created permanent outcasts who could never fully rejoin society. But if you think community-sanctioned violence was the worst form of medieval legal torture, prepare yourself for a technique so diabolical that it exploited the legal system itself to create the most prolonged and agonizing death imaginable. Pressing to death was medieval law's ultimate power move, a technique that turned the legal system against itself and created a torture method so prolonged and agonizing that it made every other form of execution look merciful by comparison. This wasn't just about killing people, it was about exploiting legal loopholes to create the most psychologically devastating form of torture ever devised. The setup was deceptively simple. The accused would be stripped naked, laid on their back on the ground, and then covered with a wooden board. Heavy stones would be placed on top of the board, gradually increasing the weight until the victim was slowly crushed to death. But the real genius wasn't in the crushing, it was in the legal framework that made crushing necessary. Here's where medieval law got absolutely diabolical. If someone refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty, they couldn't be tried for their crime. But they also couldn't be released. This created a legal limbo that courts resolved by subjecting the accused to pressing until they agreed to enter a plea. The crushing would continue until the person either confessed or died, sometimes lasting for days. The psychological torture was even worse than the physical crushing. Victims knew they could stop the torture at any time by simply saying guilty or not guilty. But entering a plea meant their property could be seized by the Crown, leaving their families destitute. So people would choose to be slowly crushed to death rather than leave their children penniless. Medieval law turned family loyalty into a death sentence. The weight progression was carefully calibrated for maximum suffering. The pressing would start with just enough weight to cause discomfort, then gradually increase over hours or days. The victim would be able to speak and breathe initially, allowing them to change their mind and enter a plea. But as the weight increased, speech became impossible, breathing became labored, and the crushing would slowly collapse their chest cavity. The most famous case of pressing to death occurred in Salem, Massachusetts, when Giles Corey was accused of witchcraft in 1692. Rather than enter a plea that would have forfeited his property, Corey chose to be pressed to death over the course of 2 days. His only recorded words during the torture were, "More weight," reportedly spoken in defiance, as his executioners asked if he wanted to confess. He died without entering a plea, preserving his family's inheritance. The legal technicalities surrounding pressing were incredibly complex. Courts had to follow specific procedures for how much weight to apply, how long to wait between additions, and what constitutes a valid plea entered under duress. Legal scholars wrote detailed treatises on proper pressing techniques, turning slow crushing into a bureaucratic procedure with forms, documentation, and official oversight. The family dynamics were absolutely heartbreaking. Relatives would be forced to watch their loved ones slowly die, knowing they could stop the torture with a single word. Children would beg their parents to just say guilty to end the suffering, while parents would endure agony to preserve their children's future. Medieval law turned family bonds into instruments of torture. The economic incentives were perverse and deliberate. The Crown wanted confessions because they enabled property seizure, but they also wanted to discourage people from refusing to enter pleas. Pressing to death served both purposes. It was so horrific that most people would eventually confess, but those who didn't would die in such agony that others would be deterred from similar defiance. The duration of pressing could be extended almost indefinitely. Some victims would survive for days under gradually increasing weight, slowly suffocating as their chest cavity collapsed. Water and small amounts of food would be provided to prolong the suffering, and physicians would monitor the victim to ensure they didn't die too quickly. Medieval courts turned dying into a prolonged legal procedure. But even pressing to death wasn't the most shocking aspect of medieval legal torture. The ultimate revelation about medieval justice isn't just that these methods were legal, it's how they reveal the true nature of medieval society's relationship with human suffering. The most deranged aspect of medieval legal torture wasn't any single method, it was the fact that these procedures were considered the height of civilized justice. We're talking about a society that looked at systematic human destruction and said, this is how reasonable people should solve legal problems. The torture chamber wasn't the dark underbelly of medieval justice, it was the main event. Medieval legal scholars didn't just tolerate torture, they celebrated it as a technological advancement in jurisprudence. Legal textbooks praised torture as a scientific method for determining truth, more reliable than witness testimony or physical evidence. Universities taught courses on proper torture techniques, and graduating lawyers were expected to understand the finer points of human destruction. Medieval people turned systematic suffering into an academic discipline. The bureaucracy of torture was absolutely staggering. Courts maintained detailed records of torture sessions, including specific techniques used, duration of application, and results obtained. Professional torturers were licensed and regulated with apprenticeship programs and professional guilds. Quality control standards ensured that torture was administered consistently and effectively. Medieval people created a civil service system for human suffering. The international standardization of torture methods shows how deeply embedded these practices were in medieval culture. The same techniques were used from England to Italy, from France to Germany, with only minor regional variations. Legal scholars traveled between countries, sharing torture innovations, and torture manuals were translated into multiple languages. Medieval Europe created an international curriculum for human destruction. The religious sanctification of torture was perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Church officials didn't just tolerate torture, they actively participated in it. Priests would bless torture instruments, pray for divine guidance during torture sessions, and provide theological justification for the procedures. The institution that claimed to represent God's love on earth turned human suffering into a religious sacrament. The family participation in torture reveals something fundamental about medieval society. Parents would bring children to public torture sessions as educational experiences. Families would make social events out of watching people die slowly. Communities would compete to inflict the most creative punishments. Medieval people turned human destruction into family entertainment. The economic system built around torture was remarkably sophisticated. Professional torturers commanded high salaries, torture equipment was manufactured and sold commercially, and public torture sessions generated significant revenue for local communities. Torture tourism was a real phenomenon, with people traveling to witness particularly notorious executions. Medieval people turned human suffering into a profitable industry. The legal protections for torturers were absolute and comprehensive. No one could be prosecuted for injuries inflicted during official torture sessions, no matter how severe. This created a legal sanctuary for the most violent members of society, allowing them to indulge their worst impulses under official sanction. Medieval law turned sadism into a respectable profession. The most shocking revelation about medieval legal torture is that it worked exactly as intended. These weren't failed experiments or misguided attempts at justice. They were perfectly successful systems for maintaining social control through terror. The torture chamber wasn't where medieval justice broke down, it was where medieval justice achieved its ultimate expression. Medieval people didn't see torture as barbaric or cruel. They saw it as the natural and necessary foundation of civilized society. The systematic destruction of human bodies wasn't a bug in the medieval legal system, it was the feature that made everything else possible. And that's the truly deranged reality of medieval justice. It wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed.